Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be here and really honored to have this conversation now with Adnan. When I started at Clean Energy Canada, it was 7 years ago, just before you started at IRENA, the International Energy Agency. And it was a bit of a stretch then, I have to say. You know, we had this vision of what renewables could do, where they could go, you know, the potential, but it was a bit of a stretch, the business case, you know, and to actually convince people that this wasn't just a boutique kind of idea. And wow, have we come a long way. Yeah. So I thought maybe we could start off just if you could tell us, in your 6 years, I guess almost 7 now, at the agency, tell us about what have been the really major developments, both on the renewable side and on the international cooperation side?
Thank you very much, Merran, and a great pleasure to be here in Vancouver, which is such a wonderful city, and I'm always stunned by the Canadian ability to be so bright and cogent so early in the morning. But let me say, from the perspective of IRENA as an international organization, there was a momentum for the development of a renewables agency for many years. But it never had traction in the international system because there was always a perception that this was a fringe sort of energy. It was not reliable, not enough was known about it, and many developing countries that were installing new power systems for development really didn't see it as an option. But all of this began to change around 10 years ago. And costs started to decline, knowledge about the technology started to increase. We became credible because you know when the incumbent industries start to lobby against you, you become a serious proposition. So we ran into those kind of issues. So when the organization became a formal international organization 6 years ago, I had the honor to be elected as the first Director General. We were at the beginning of a remarkable transition that has begun to happen in the world in terms of how energy systems, the perception of energy, the management of energy, the integration of energy in our lives, driving our growth and development has transformed. And part of that is due to the fact that a few front-runner countries invested quite heavily in this field. The Germans, for instance, investing in solar and in wind. We've had in the last 9 years, the cost reductions have been dramatic. So if you take solar power, solar photovoltaics, we've had a 90% decrease in cost of technology over the last 9 years. For onshore wind, around 40 to 50%. Offshore wind has declined dramatically, CSP and other technologies. So that has come at a time when a lot of countries are looking at new options of how they're going to power their future. A lot of countries are constrained in terms of their choices with fossils. Many are net energy importing countries, and they're looking at a new technology that is emerging with a new knowledge framework around it and are very interested in moving in this direction. So when we started, you know, our mandate was broadly develop the knowledge framework around renewables, develop a state-of-the-art assessment capability for the evolution of technology, looking at costs, developing planning frameworks, understanding how policy frameworks are going to drive renewables, and also providing specific technical advisory services, especially to developing countries in the energy transition. And this has exploded. We started with around 57 countries. There are 180 countries now involved. In 6 years, we've gone up to that level, still waiting for Canada. Welcome anytime. But the demand has just been exponential. The interest that has been sparked, the knowledge about the positive experiences we're seeing around the world in terms of countries that are installing renewables has sparked a tremendous new transformative, imaginative momentum. And more countries are coming to the table to share experiences. The demands for our services is, you know, we cannot manage anymore given the demand, so we have to prioritize quite heavily. But just look at the remarkable things that are happening around the world. I just came from China. China, which has the world's biggest electricity system. I had dinner with the chairman of the state grid. The state grid has more generating capacity and power that they're carrying than the whole of Europe and most of North America combined.
Wow.
27% of that is slated to be renewables very soon. The rate at which they're installing solar and wind is the highest in the world. The solar market in China employs 2.5 million people today. It's a huge driver for economic growth and employment. I was recently in Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia in the climate discussion and in the energy transition discussion has always been regarded as a stumbling block to the discussion. 3 weeks ago, we just launched a new initiative in Saudi Arabia for a $50 billion investment in renewable energy, primarily solar, but some wind. And they have the ambition of adding 9.5 gigawatts of renewable power into their system by 2023. That's 6 years' time. That's more than a gigawatt of new power capacity every year. And I have no doubt they're going to do it because the operating agent that they've asked to take care of this is the state oil company, Aramco, which has probably the strongest managerial capacity in the country. So they're doing this not because they've suddenly become climate advocates or they're against oil, but because they see the future in a very different way. And they know that the evolution of energy in the future is not going to be what it is today. And it's the same in most oil-producing countries today who are engaged with us in our process. And one of the most remarkable ones is I was in Moscow a few weeks ago. We launched our roadmap for Moscow for energy transition. A lot of people didn't believe that we were going to do this, but we did this together with the Ministry of Energy. We have a projection that they can quadruple renewable energy in their system by 2030. The Minister of Energy agreed with that assessment publicly. And we have a new program of growth in the Russian Federation where energy is almost free for consumers. And at one point in a private conversation, I asked him, we're successful in many countries which are net energy importers because the cost of renewables is going down. So there's a very strong business case now. But in the Russian context, I'm a bit curious why you're moving this direction. And he made a very interesting comment, which I think goes to the heart of what is happening, which is said, we know the world of energy is going to change. The technology that's driving this, the research and development that's going into this is going to be a new industrial infrastructure for the future. And we have to decide whether we want to be the part of the vanguard of this movement of change, or we want to be struggling a few years down the road to catch up with everybody else. And we've decided to move in this direction. So this is just to illustrate the kind of remarkable things that are happening in this field today.
Yeah, it is quite remarkable to hear that even Russia is getting on board. I want to go back to China because I think there's a lot of images people have had of China, the pollution and the stories, building a coal plant every week. Can you paint us a picture for what you just saw when you were in China, and what are some of the top policies or initiatives that are really driving that change? What's working?
Well, I've been engaged with China for a few years now, quite intensely, because it's the biggest renewable energy market in the world today. China undertook the imperative of growth of their economy some time ago. They had hundreds of millions of people who were still in poverty. Despite the environmental impact that this growth has had, not only in China but worldwide, they have lifted over 400 million people out of poverty. This was the predominant objective that they had with their model of fast economic growth. And it's remarkable how lifestyles have changed. But as this has happened, China has begun to evolve dramatically. On the one hand, people are better off. They have choice in their economic decisions much more. There is a much more global engagement in terms of what's happening in the world and awareness of climate. I can tell you, everybody in China is aware of the climate discussion, and there's a very strong support for government engagement. And President Xi made a statement in Davos and just reiterated this last week in Beijing, talking about the absolute commitment that China had to lead in the field of climate change and carbon emissions. There is an industrial growth that has now started to move from the primarily manufacturing, heavy fossil-oriented to much more services and technology. The ability to integrate renewable energy has spawned a huge industrial development in China. I've been in roundtables with CEOs of Chinese companies in the renewable energy field, which is just mind-blowing. You're sitting with these people who are really at the cutting edge of technology in terms of pioneering smart grid systems, integration of variability into power systems, software for management of systems, data for the next generation of renewables. And they've started to invest in some of the key strategic sectors, which are going to make a huge difference. One of those is they are the biggest installer of ultra-high voltage transmission lines across China, from the renewable energy producing areas in the west to the load centers in the east. Now, this technology is going to be a game changer because it allows you to transmit huge amounts of renewable electricity with minimum loss over large distances. This is going to be very important in different regions of the world, and they're really at the cutting edge of this. So on power management, you know, they're the biggest installers of solar, of wind. They have dramatically reduced the costs of all of these technologies. But they're looking at the next generation in a very interesting way, because one of the things that they're really investing in now is the future of electric mobility. Because we know if we win the battle on renewable electricity, and we know that the future is going to be electricity, how do we deal with the end-use sectors? And the largest one, of course, is transportation. So they've invested all of their R&D investment now, not in conventional vehicles. They're producing conventional vehicles quite a lot, but they're using existing technology that's available. But all of their R&D is going into electric vehicles, how electric vehicles are going to be designed, what the platform is going to be, the technology, the drive chains, storage, battery storage, and all of these things. And they're anticipating to have 6 million electric vehicles on the roads by 2030. Last year was a record worldwide where we had 2 million new electric vehicles coming in buses and other vehicles. They're looking at 6 million by 2030. And I think that that is going to be an extremely important evolution, because it points to how the electricity system is going to evolve, in the sense that storage embodied in electric vehicles is going to become much more a part of the management of electricity systems in the future. So those are the kind of imaginative things they're doing, but they see this basically from the economic perspective. They know they have a responsibility on climate and carbon. They are the biggest emitting country in the world. They want to take action to reduce that, but at the same time, they want to do it on the basis of an economic case, which is going to give them a competitive advantage in the future.
Yeah, well, I'd love to follow up on the electric vehicle piece, because that's, you know, as you said, the end users are really the next piece that we need to solve of this puzzle. You know, there's a lot of talk about electric vehicles now. They're sexy, they're much more cost competitive, but, you know, one side keeps saying, you know, for the stock to turn over, it's going to be slow. You know, others say Bloomberg New Energy Finance is saying 2023, 2030, we're going to see a big boom. What do you say?
I think that there are going to be huge opportunities. I think what China is doing is setting alarm bell ringing in countries that are big producers of vehicles. Last year, I was at a very interesting forum that was convened by Goldman Sachs, of all people, in London. Goldman Sachs' sustainable investment portfolio has mushroomed in the last 4 years, and the bulk of it is going for renewables. They're financing a lot of very interesting R&D, especially in electric vehicles. So the news of what China is doing is really beginning to make others sit up and think about it. We had, you know, the strategic planners from Daimler and BMW in this discussion. And it was a wake-up call for them that although they have started moving in the direction of electric vehicles, some cases doing some work in hydrogen vehicles and so on, they understood that the market of the future is going to be far more competitive for them than what it is now, with their dominant position, and that a lot of R&D, which they had not anticipated, is going into electric vehicles in other parts of the world, and that they're going to have to really pay attention to this. So this is the remarkable thing, is that those car manufacturers we always considered at the cutting edge are now realizing that if they don't do something about their model, they're going to have to catch up in the future. But the real thing about this is, and you know, this is the wonderful thing about the decision making that's taking place in cities. If you start to change city fleets to electric vehicles, the message that gives to the market is huge. The message that gives to electric vehicle manufacturers is huge. And that's one of the reasons I'm very happy to be here with the pioneering work that Vancouver has done in this. Because cities are going to be, and regional governments are going to be huge drivers in terms of sending signals to industry of what their expectation is. So I think the future is going to be electric. If you look at the data revolution we're seeing, we have new companies that are emerging that are managing electricity with data in ways that we had never anticipated, very low cost. I'm absolutely convinced that the energy revolution is going to be the revolution that enables many countries to leapfrog the polluting infrastructure of the past. The same way that mobile telephony and telecommunications allowed countries to leapfrog the landline infrastructure of the past. So we're going to be dealing with electricity in very different ways in the future than we are today. And I think that from our perspective, you know, to share something with you, I worked in the climate field for a long time, and in the environmental field in the United Nations and other places. The climate discussion had become completely polarized, politicized, and locked up.
Yeah.
There's very little that was happening.
Mm-hmm.
I was absolutely convinced that if the energy transformation happened, that would possibly be the only way that we as a global community can achieve the goals of decarbonization that we need to maintain a safe temperature increase. And the only way we would do that is if we prove the economic case for it. And I think that is what has happened in the last 5 or 6 years. Not everybody's on board. There are a lot of oil companies and traditional utilities that are still kind of putting the brakes on and trying to message in different ways. But the momentum is there today. And this change, in my view, renewables and energy efficiency, and this is what we have found in our research on decarbonization, is going to be probably the only way that we can achieve a below 2-degree world in the future. That's why it's so important.
Yeah, so let's come home here to Canada. What recommendations would you have for Canada? We have a very clean grid, over 80% carbon free. Mm-hmm. What's the next step for us? Our supply is good. What do we need to do next here?
You have huge assets in Canada. You have huge clean energy assets. One of your huge assets is hydro. One of the problems we have with the new electricity systems in terms of the variability that comes with wind and solar is where is the capacity to be able to balance that to ensure some kind of predictability in the grid. And hydro provides that. Hydro is probably the best electricity source that you can have to balance variability across the system. So with the amount of hydro you have in the system, you have the capability to have a 100% clean electricity system in Canada. And I think that is your challenge, is to figure out how, with the different sources that you have available in Canada, how you can turn your domestic electricity generation more and more renewable. I think it's over 60% already. We did an assessment of what you could do to 2030 in terms of pathways, and we think you can achieve 90% very easily by that time. What this does also is gives you an economic stimulus. If you start investing in new types of industry, you know, the world has gone, since 2008, the world has gone through a very slow economic recovery process. Countries have started to recover, but one of the features of this recovery has been that it's largely jobless. We have huge pockets in industrial and developing countries where there is huge youth unemployment. We have to find new ways of infrastructure investment and growth that generates employment in new types of enterprise. And I think that this energy transition provides a possibility to do something like that because it also goes into many other fields. So I think for Canada, it's very difficult in oil-producing countries because they have to make the transition from the fact that their prosperity, and yours is much more diverse, but if you take Russia and Saudi Arabia and others, their prosperity has come from oil and gas. So it's very hard to shift your mindset to a situation where oil and gas is not going to be so important. But those who are looking at this strategically realize that the future is not in oil and gas. The future of electricity is going to be in renewables. And they've started to invest in that. So I think that's one area where there needs to be some kind of greater political momentum and greater policy-making support to those people in Canada who are working in these fields. I think you have huge technical capabilities, which you need to deploy much more effectively in these fields. And you need to start looking at what new technologies are emerging and what the Canadian R&D infrastructure can contribute to that in terms of what the new software is going to be for managing power systems. You have a huge country, Does transmission have to be organized and managed in a different way? You have a provincial structure, and sometimes it's quite difficult to cross boundaries to be able to manage this, and you have to look at regulatory reform. How do you manage electricity across provincial lines? How do you have a regulatory framework that allows you to value electricity across the board in the country? And you have very interesting companies in Canada that have a lot of this capability. So I think that is the future, and you have to look at oil and gas in a very different way.
So is there any lessons learned from Saudi Arabia that you think you or they could share with Canada, how to get that conversation more active in our oil and gas sector?
The governance framework of Saudi Arabia and of Canada are a little bit different. So I think it's easier to make top-down decisions in Saudi Arabia if you convince the people at the top that this is the right thing to do. In Canada, I think the difference is that you have a very vibrant kind of democratic process. I heard our moderator this morning talking about that. Everything becomes democratic, including the way you manage these meetings. But I think in Canada's case, it has to be a bottom-up process. I think there is huge understanding in various sectors of Canadian society about the opportunity that this brings. And I think that these events like this that really begin to bring that constituency together, gather force, share experiences, and really look at the future in a new way. I think what would be interesting to look at is how Germany did it. And when you look at the German electricity system today, there are 1.7 million points of power generation that come into the system every day, including household owners, people who have solar on their rooftop, communities that own a couple of wind turbines, and so on. And they need to have a market structure that enables you to integrate all of this into the system. You have to have data systems and transmission system operators who are able to balance this in real time, to have predictive capability in terms of what solar and wind is going to be at any particular time. I've spent some time looking at the system of a transmission system operator in the eastern part of Germany called 50 Hertz, who has 45% of variable renewables in his system without storage. And he has managed this with 98% reliability, and his system is more reliable than any other system in Germany. And I asked him, how did you do this? And he said, well, there are a number of areas you have to work. One is the market, to understand the market, and how do you buy and sell electricity in a market that's going to have so many players in it. So that regulatory framework has to be robust. You have to improve your technical capabilities. So the management of the grid codes, and to have control systems that are able to look at this in real time and be able to manage that has to be there. And when they went through this solar eclipse a couple of years ago in Germany, there was a lot of hyperventilation that, the eclipse and all the solar that's in the system, everything is going to crash and burn, and, there's going to be a blackout in Germany and so on. And he said he was now able to predict solar insolation and wind generation within a 2 to 3% degree of certainty, 24 hours ahead. So his planning for managing that, and the fact that he had an interconnection with the Scandinavian countries and was able to bring in hydro from Scandinavian countries, allowed him to manage the solar eclipse with absolutely no interruption to the system. So how we do this is going to be the secret. And there are people who have already pioneered this. You don't have to import hydro. You have it right here. So you have all the ingredients to make a system that is more robust, that is clean, that is green, and that can really be an example of how we get to the next generation of power systems in the future.
Yes. Yeah, so lots to do here at home. What about cities? You know, that's what the topic of conversation is here this week. And you've conducted research on how to use the concentrated urban centers as real, you know, places where you're going to drive the renewables. And places here like Vancouver have committed to 100% renewables. So tell us what you think is the best potential, the best steps for cities in this transition.
Yeah. Well, we're not going to have huge solar farms and wind farms in the middle of cities at any time. It's what decisions cities take in procuring power, in regulating power and individual choices relating to energy, and giving market signals to those who are providing electricity to the cities. I think that is going to be extremely important on one side. But the other is what decisions you take domestically. How do you regulate and drive, retrofitting old buildings, creating energy efficiency infrastructure in cities, incentivizing that? There's a huge business case for that. We haven't done well enough on energy efficiency. That's got to be the other part of the energy strategy of cities. So energy efficiency. Transportation is huge. It was a very interesting exercise this morning, who used a bicycle and who flew here. I think how cities create an infrastructure for transportation for the future and how that is powered is going to be extremely important. In the global south, we have mega cities which are growing up with huge problems of overcrowding, traffic, and pollution. It's literally killing people. I think that's one of the drivers in China, by the way, that Chinese people cannot breathe in the big cities anymore. And that is driving this kind of renaissance also. We have to find solutions to these things. And it is cities that have the leadership and the enlightenment and the capability, like Vancouver and like other cities in the Northern Hemisphere, but also cities in developing countries. What are the choices that cities are going to make that are going to drive future investment? If you decide that you want to be 100% renewables, the people who are producing power to you need to take that into account because you are a big load center for the provision of power. And how you manage that, is an impetus also to the technology companies and the data providers of how you manage that in cities. And how you give signals on transportation is going to be a huge market signal to vehicle producers that what type of vehicles are required in the future and what decisions they need to make now in terms of their investment in what they will be providing you 10 years down the road. So I think cities are becoming more and more important. I think regional governments have become more and more important. I saw a very interesting article recently that if you want to do anything about climate change, ask the mayors and governors to do something because the national governments are now paralyzed as far as climate policy is concerned. To an extent, that's very true. It's very true because at the national level, there are so many different competing interests. And the power of incumbency, we talk about democratic decision-making, but when you have huge lobbying capabilities and incumbents who are able to finance election campaigns for politicians, the kind of messaging in terms of the future of energy at the national level is very skewed compared to what is happening at the local level because here you're dealing with real issues, the quality of people's lives, and the decisions you are taking are going to impact how we live our everyday life. That's not the preoccupation of the national politician all the time. So I think this is becoming more and more, and this is one of the reasons I'm very pleased to be here and I hope to have more and more engagement with mayors and regional governments in the future, because the decision-making that they take may not change national policy overnight, but the cumulative signals of that to industry and to politics are going to be immensely powerful, and they're going to be really actors in the front line of change on climate and energy for the future.
Yeah. Well, I'm getting the signal it's time to wrap up. I have lots of more questions I'd like to ask. And just so you know, we didn't go into a Q&A. I did crowdsource some of these questions in advance. But the last question I want to ask you is, you know, you've been working on sustainability and climate change and clean energy for many, many years. And what about this inspires you? What keeps you going?
It was very hard a few years ago because, you know, you were always considered these kind of fringe people who, okay, you have a nice heart and you want to do nice things in the world, but it's, you're not really serious. We have to feed people, we have to clothe people, we have to transport people. I think the most inspiring thing that's happened in the last few years is, one, we have understood the scale of the challenge of transformation that we have, and more people are coming on board. And two is that we today have solutions. We have solutions that are economically viable and solutions that are vital to our survival as a human community in the next 20 years. We have to take these decisions now, and the inspiring thing is that there are so many actors and leaders and individuals who are committed to this change, and you can actually see it begin to happen. When would we have had this? I was at a award ceremony for SMEs who are developing new softwares for renewable energy integration into grids. Young people, you know, coming out of university who are doing such interesting things of how you manage data and electricity. And it was in Germany, and it was remarkable. It was like the Oscars of clean energy. There was this huge cinema. And I said to them, you know, when I started, the first award ceremony I went to was 30 people in a rented basement in Berlin. And we only had 24 beers in the corner, so first come, first serve. And here we are, that this momentum has started, that there's a sense of opportunity, there's excitement about it, and you really feel that you can make a change, you are empowered, but that this is a change that's not only positive for our future, it is something that empowers us and gives us a quality of life that is exponentially better than what we would have had otherwise.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Merran. Great pleasure.
Yes. Thanks to all of you, and really thank you very much for all the work you do in the world.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
And I'm glad you're having more fun now.